The mountain air had grown cold and unforgiving, mirroring the desperation that had settled into Martha Henderson's bones like an old ache. At 73 years old, she'd thought she'd seen everything life could throw at her. But nothing had prepared her for the relentless assault nature was waging against her small chicken farm, nestled in the remote corners of Montana's wilderness. Every morning for the past 8 months had begun the same way, with dread pooling in her stomach as she made the walk from her weathered 2-story farmhouse to the chicken coops. The path, worn smooth by decades of her footsteps, now felt like a walk to a crime scene. More often than not, she'd find feathers scattered like snow across the ground, blood spattering the wooden fence posts, and the haunting silence where clucking hens should have been greeting the dawn. The wolf had started coming around in February, when the winter had been particularly brutal and prey scarce in the deep woods. Martha had first spotted him, a massive gray timber wolf with eyes like polished amber and a coat that seemed to absorb the moonlight, standing at the edge of her property line, studying her chickens with the calculated patience of a predator who knew time was on his side. That first night, he'd taken 3 of her best laying hens, tearing through the chicken wire like it was tissue paper. She'd called the rangers the very next morning, her voice shaking as she described the carnage. They'd come out, examined the tracks, confirmed it was indeed a wolf, and told her what she already knew but didn't want to hear. There wasn't much they could do. The wolves were protected. They could set up some motion sensor lights, reinforce her fencing, maybe try some deterrent sounds, but ultimately, if a wolf wanted something badly enough, it would find a way. And find a way it did. Martha had sunk nearly $3,000 into reinforcing her chicken coops, new fencing with steel mesh, motion-activated floodlights that could illuminate half an acre, even those ultrasonic deterrent devices she'd ordered off the internet that promised to keep predators at bay. The wolf watched her install every defense, those amber eyes tracking her movements from the tree line, and then he adapted. He started coming in the late afternoon instead of night, when the lights wouldn't be as disorienting. He found the weak points in the fencing where the ground dipped and squeezed underneath. He was learning, evolving, and Martha was losing the war of attrition. But the wolf wasn't her only problem. The American lynx, a sleek, tawny ghost of a cat with tufted ears and oversized paws designed for silent hunting, had discovered her farm in April. Unlike the wolf's brutal, straightforward attacks, the lynx was an artist of infiltration. It could scale the 6-foot fence without making a sound, drop into the enclosed run like a shadow made of flesh, and disappear with a chicken before Martha even knew it had been there. She'd only seen it clearly once, on a bright morning when it had gotten bold, sitting atop her fence post grooming itself with the casual arrogance of an apex predator that feared nothing. The rangers had been sympathetic, but ultimately useless. "Ma'am, the lynx population in this region is already threatened," the younger ranger, a fresh-faced kid who couldn't have been more than 25, had explained during his 3rd visit to her property. "Even if we wanted to relocate it, we'd need to prove it's an immediate danger to human life, and unfortunately, livestock losses don't meet that threshold." "These aren't just livestock," Martha had snapped, her patience worn to a frayed thread. "These chickens are my livelihood. This farm is all I have." The ranger had looked down at his boots, genuinely apologetic but bound by regulations that valued wildlife over the economic survival of a single elderly woman. "I understand, Mrs. Henderson. I really do. Have you considered installing a roof over the chicken run? That might keep the lynx out." She'd spent another $2,000 on wire mesh roofing. The lynx had found a gap where the new roof met the old fence within 48 hours. By June, Martha was losing an average of 4 chickens a week. Her flock, which had once numbered over 200 birds, a mixture of Rhode Island Reds, Buff Orpingtons, and hardy Barred Rocks, had dwindled to barely 90. Her egg production had plummeted. The local restaurants and farmers markets that had once been her steady customers were looking elsewhere for suppliers, unwilling to deal with her inconsistent delivery schedule. Her monthly income, which had been modest but sufficient to cover her mortgage, utilities, and living expenses with a little left over for savings, had shrunk to the point where she was dipping into her retirement fund just to buy feed for the remaining chickens. The financial stress was crushing, but it was the fear that truly kept her awake at night. Martha Henderson had lived alone on this property for 15 years, ever since her husband Harold had passed from a sudden heart attack while fixing the barn door. She'd never been afraid before, had actually relished the solitude, the independence, the quiet satisfaction of building something with her own two hands. But now every sound in the darkness made her jump. Every howl echoing through the mountain valleys sent ice water through her veins. She'd started sleeping with Harold's old hunting rifle propped against her nightstand, though she'd never been much of a shot and doubted she could hit a moving wolf even if she tried. The worst part was the helplessness. Martha Henderson had survived the death of her parents, raised 3 children mostly on her own while Harold worked long-haul trucking jobs, weathered economic recessions, and rebuilt this farm from nothing after they'd bought the property for a sawing back in the 80s. She'd always been a fighter, a solver of problems, a woman who could fix what was broken and endure what couldn't be fixed. But she couldn't fight nature itself. She couldn't reason with a hungry wolf or negotiate with a territorial lynx. By August, she'd made the decision she'd sworn she'd never make. She was going to sell the farm and move back to the city. Her daughter, Rebecca, had an apartment building in Seattle with a vacant unit. It was small, a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor with a view of a parking lot, but it was safe. No wolves prowling in the shadows, no lynx watching from the fence posts, no morning ritual of counting her losses and wondering how much longer she could hold on. She'd called a real estate agent and had the property appraised. The news was not good. Her farm, which she'd poured her life savings and 15 years of backbreaking work into, was worth less than she'd hoped. The remote location, the wildlife issues, the needed repairs to the barn and outbuildings, it all drove the value down. She'd walk away with enough to pay off her remaining mortgage and maybe put a small down payment on a modest condo in the city, but the farm that was supposed to be her legacy, the inheritance she'd planned to leave her children, would be gone for a fraction of what it was worth. The defeat tasted bitter as copper in her mouth, but Martha was a realist. She couldn't keep throwing money at a losing battle. She couldn't keep living in fear. She started packing, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions, deciding what was worth keeping and what could be sold or donated. Every item she wrapped in newspaper felt like another piece of her life being dismantled, but she pushed through, determined to be gone before the first snow fell in October. And then came her anniversary. September 23rd would have been her 48th wedding anniversary if Harold had lived. For the past 15 years since his death, Martha had marked the day with quiet reflection, usually alone, sometimes visiting his grave at the small cemetery 20 miles down the mountain. But this year, knowing it might be her last anniversary on the farm, her children had insisted on coming to visit. All 3 of them, Rebecca from Seattle, Michael from Portland, and David from Boise, had coordinated their schedules, arranged time off work, and made the long drive to their mother's remote mountain property for a proper family gathering. They had arrived on Friday afternoon, their cars laden with groceries, wine, and enough food for a feast. Martha had protested, "You shouldn't have gone to all this trouble." But secretly, she was grateful. The house felt alive again, with her children's voices echoing through the rooms, her grandchildren racing through the halls, and the warm chaos of a family reunited, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. Rebecca, her oldest at 45, had taken charge of the kitchen with the efficiency of a general marshaling troops. She'd inherited her mother's no-nonsense practicality and her father's stubborn streak, a combination that had served her well in her career as a hospital administrator. "Mom, you sit down," she'd ordered when Martha tried to help with the cooking. "We're doing this for you. Just relax and let us take care of everything." Michael, 2 years younger than her sister, had taken his 2 teenage sons out to inspect the chicken coops, genuinely interested in understanding the predator problems his mother had been dealing with. He worked as a wildlife biologist for the state of Oregon, and Martha could see him analyzing the damage with a professional eye, noting the claw marks on the fence posts, the disturbed earth where the wolf had dug underneath, the neat puncture wounds in the chicken wire where the lynx had tested for weaknesses. "Mom," he'd said quietly, pulling her aside, "this is serious. I knew you were having problems, but I didn't realize it was this bad." David, the baby of the family at 39, and the only one who'd inherited his father's easygoing humor, had set about fixing all the small things around the house that Martha had been putting off. The squeaky screen door, the loose railing on the porch steps, the kitchen cabinet that wouldn't close properly. He was a contractor by trade, and his hands were never idle. "Mom's moving to the city over my dead body," he'd announced to his siblings, though he knew as well as they did that their mother had made up her mind. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that makes Montana's mountains legendary. Crisp air carrying the scent of pine and falling leaves, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun dropped toward the jagged horizon, and a gentle breeze that felt like nature's blessing. They'd set up a long table on the back porch, close enough to the house to use the kitchen, but positioned to take advantage of the spectacular view of the valley below and the mountains beyond. Martha had protested this too. "It's getting cold, we should eat inside," but her children had been insistent. "Mom, when's the next time we'll all be together on the farm?" Rebecca had asked, and the unspoken truth hung in the air. Never, if Martha went through with selling. The table had been set with Martha's good china, the set she'd inherited from her mother and rarely used, each plate painted with delicate blue flowers that had somehow survived decades without a single chip. There were 8 places set: Martha, her 3 children, and 4 grandchildren ranging in age from 9 to 17. The food had been abundant, almost excessive. A herb-roasted turkey that Michael had spent hours preparing, Rebecca's famous garlic mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, homemade rolls that Martha's grandmother Emma had insisted on making from scratch, 3 different salads, and enough pies and desserts to feed 20 people. They'd said grace, Harold's old tradition that Martha had maintained, and then fallen into the easy rhythm of a family meal, passing dishes, sharing stories, laughing at old memories, and creating new ones. Martha's grandson Tyler had told an elaborate story about his high school football team's disastrous homecoming game that had everyone in stitches. Rebecca and Michael had gotten into a good-natured argument about politics that David had skillfully diffused with a well-timed joke. Emma had asked her grandmother dozens of questions about what it was like growing up in the 50s, genuinely fascinated by a world without internet or cell phones. For a few hours, Martha had forgotten about the wolves and lynx and failing farm. She'd forgotten about the packed boxes in her bedroom and the real estate listings she'd been studying. She was just a mother and grandmother, surrounded by the people she loved most, sharing a meal in a home she'd built with her own determination and stubbornness. The sun had fully set by the time they'd finished the main course, and Rebecca had just stood up to start clearing plates when Martha's youngest granddaughter, 9-year-old Sophie, had suddenly gone rigid in her chair, her eyes fixed on something beyond the porch light's reach. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice high and tight with fear, "there's something in the yard." Every head had turned, conversations dying mid-sentence as they all looked out into the darkening twilight. The motion sensor lights, triggered by something large moving in their range, had suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the backyard in harsh white light. And there, walking across the grass with the casual confidence of an invited guest, was a bear. Not just any bear, a massive grizzly, easily 7 feet tall and weighing what had to be 600 or 700 pounds or more. His coat was a rich dark brown that caught the light in ripples of muscle moving beneath fur.
His head was broad and powerful, with small round ears and eyes that reflected the light like copper coins. He moved with the rolling gait particular to bears, deceptively quick for something so large, and he was heading directly toward their dinner table.
"Nobody move," Michael had hissed, his wildlife biologist training kicking in immediately. "Stay calm. Don't run. Bears are attracted to food, so he's probably smelling dinner. We need to slowly back toward the house." But before anyone could move, the bear had reached the porch steps. 8 stairs separated the backyard from the elevated porch, and the grizzly had climbed them with surprising grace, his massive paws making the wooden steps creak ominously under his weight. The family had frozen, terror holding them immobile as the apex predator of the Rocky Mountains approached their dinner table. Rebecca had reached for her children, pulling them behind her in a mother's instinctive gesture of protection. David had slowly moved his hand toward his belt, where Martha knew he kept a pocket knife, utterly useless against a grizzly but the only weapon at hand. Michael had positioned himself between the bear and the children, his face pale but determined. The grandchildren had gone silent, their faces masks of fear. The bear had reached the table, and that's when something extraordinary had happened. Instead of attacking, instead of swiping at them with claws that could disembowel a person with one swipe, instead of roaring that terrifying sound that turns human spines to jelly, the bear had simply sat down. Not on all fours like a bear normally sits, but in a chair. In the empty chair they'd set at the end of the table, the one Martha had put there without really thinking about it, a habit left over from when Harold was alive, and she always set a place for him. The grizzly had pulled the chair back slightly with one massive paw, turned around, and lowered his haunches onto the seat like a person would, his broad back against the chair back, his front paws resting on the edge of the table. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped chirping. The family stared at the bear, and the bear looked back at them with what could only be described as expectation. What is he doing?" Rebecca had breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have no idea," Michael had responded. His professional bewilderment filled his tone. "I've never seen behavior like this, ever. Bears don't sit in chairs. They don't approach humans this calmly. They don't—" "He just wants some food," Martha had said suddenly, surprising herself with the calmness in her voice. Something about the bear's posture, the patience in his eyes, the complete lack of aggression in his demeanor had flipped a switch in her brain from terror to understanding. "Mom, are you crazy?" David had said, louder than he'd intended, earning a sharp look from his mother. "That's a grizzly bear. You can't feed a grizzly bear." "Well, he's sitting at our table, isn't he?" Martha had replied, with a logic that made no sense, but somehow felt exactly right. "And he's not threatening anyone. Look at him, David. Really look at him. Does he look like he's about to attack?" They'd all really looked at the enormous predator sitting at their dinner table. His mouth was closed, no bared teeth. His ears were forward, curious, rather than flattened in aggression. His paws were resting on the table, not raised to strike. His entire body language, as absurd as it sounded, was one of polite waiting. "He's been watching us," Martha had continued, a realization dawning as she spoke. "He smelled the turkey, the food, and he came to investigate. But he's not acting like a wild animal. He's acting like he knows how to behave at a dinner table." "This is impossible," Michael had finished, his scientific mind struggling to categorize what he was witnessing. "Bear behavior doesn't work this way, unless he's been habituated to humans before. Maybe he was a cub that was raised by people, or he's been fed by campers." Martha hadn't cared about the explanation. She'd simply stood up, ignoring her children's protests, and walked into the kitchen. She'd returned a moment later carrying the large serving platter, and on it was the rest of the turkey, nearly 10 pounds of roasted bird that they'd been planning to use for leftovers. "Mom, don't," Rebecca had started to say, but Martha had already approached the bear's chair. The grizzly had watched her approach with those intelligent copper eyes, not moving, barely breathing. When Martha had set the platter down in front of him, placing it on the table as she would for any dinner guest, the bear had looked at the food, then back at Martha, and in that moment, something had passed between them, an understanding,
a mutual respect, a treaty between species signed in silence. Then the bear had begun to eat, not with the savage brutality one might expect, but with surprising delicacy. He'd used his claws to tear pieces from the turkey, bringing them to his mouth with almost a refined manner. He'd chewed thoroughly, seemingly savoring the herb-crusted skin and the tender meat. He hadn't made a mess, hadn't knocked over glasses or dishes, hadn't done anything more disruptive than any other dinner guest might have. The Henderson family had watched in stunned silence as a 600-pound grizzly bear ate roasted turkey at their dinner table. It had taken him perhaps 10 minutes to clean the serving platter, leaving nothing but bones picked clean. When he'd finished, he'd sat back in the chair looking satisfied, and then he'd simply stood up, pushed the chair back in with one paw, an action so human it sent chills down everyone's spine, and walked back down the porch steps. At the bottom of the stairs, he'd paused and looked back at Martha. She'd met his gaze, and in that moment she'd felt an inexplicable connection, as if the bear was acknowledging her gift, thanking her in the only way he could. Then he turned and walked across the yard, the motion lights tracking his progress, and disappeared into the dark forest from which he had come. Nobody had spoken for a full minute after he'd left. They'd all stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just witnessed, wondering if they'd collectively hallucinated the most bizarre dinner guest in history. "Did that really just happen?" Emma had asked, her voice small and shaky. "I think so," Michael had replied, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling every wildlife expert I know. This has to be documented. A bear sitting in a chair, eating from a plate. This could rewrite behavioral science textbooks." But Martha had barely heard him. She'd been staring at the forest edge where the bear had disappeared, a strange warmth spreading through her chest, an intuition she couldn't name telling her that something significant had just occurred, something that would change everything. She'd been right, though she couldn't have imagined how profound that change would be. The bear had returned the next night, Sunday evening, just as twilight was settling over the mountains and Martha's children were preparing to leave in the morning. The motion lights triggered again. The family, still gathered on the porch and half expecting a repeat visit, had watched as the same grizzly emerged from the forest and made his way across the yard. This time they'd been prepared. Michael had insisted on setting up his professional camera equipment to document the encounter. Rebecca had declared that if the bear was going to keep visiting, they might as well be ready with appropriate food. David had reinforced the porch railings, worried that the bear's weight might eventually damage the structure. Martha had prepared a large salmon, one of the big king salmon that she'd bought from the local fishery and kept frozen for special occasions. She'd placed it on a large wooden cutting board, garnished it with the lemon and dill that she'd used to flavor it, and set it on the table as the bear mounted the steps. Once again, the grizzly had taken his seat at the end of the table, had waited with that same remarkable patience, and had eaten what Martha offered with the same careful manners. This time Martha had sat at the table with him while he ate, only 3 feet separating her from a creature that could end her life with a single swipe of his paw. Her children had watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as their 73-year-old mother shared a meal with a wild grizzly bear as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When the bear had finished his salmon, he'd left the same way he had come, pausing again at the forest edge to look back before disappearing into the darkness. "Mom, you cannot keep feeding that bear," Michael had insisted after the grizzly had gone. "This is dangerous. You're creating a food-dependent relationship with an apex predator. If he associates humans with food, he could become aggressive when food isn't available, or he could approach other people who won't be as calm as you are. The rangers would have to euthanize him." "Then I suppose I'd better keep feeding him," Martha had replied simply, and something in her tone told her children that arguing would be pointless. They'd left Monday morning with deep misgivings, making Martha promise to call every day and to immediately contact the rangers if the bear showed any signs of aggression. But the bear had shown no aggression. He'd returned Monday night and Tuesday night and Wednesday night, establishing a routine. Around dusk, between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, the motion lights would trigger, and the grizzly would emerge from the forest, cross the yard, climb the porch steps, and take his seat at Martha's table. She'd prepare whatever she could, fish when she had it, large cuts of meat, even several whole chickens from her dwindling flock when she had nothing else suitable for a bear's appetite. He'd eat what she offered, rest for a few minutes as if digesting, and then leave, always pausing at the forest edge for that final look back. Martha had named him Duke, after her father, who had also been a large, quietly powerful presence with impeccable manners despite his imposing size. She'd stopped seeing Duke as a threat and had begun to think of him as, well, not quite a pet, she wasn't that naive, but as something closer to a wild neighbor with whom she'd formed an unexpected friendship.
And then, about 2 weeks after that first remarkable dinner, Martha had noticed something strange. The wolf hadn't attacked her chickens in 6 days. 6 days without a loss was unprecedented in the past 8 months. She'd initially chalked it up to random chance. Maybe the wolf had found easier prey elsewhere. Maybe he'd moved to a different territory. Maybe he'd been hit by a car on the mountain road. But then a week passed, then 10 days, then 2 full weeks without a single wolf attack. The chicken wire that had been repeatedly compromised remained intact. The ground beneath the fence where the wolf had dug showed no new disturbances. The eerie howling that had haunted her nights had gone silent. And the lynx, the sleek, tawny ghost that had been bleeding her dry with its regular raids, had also disappeared. The fence posts where Martha had seen it perched, grooming itself with arrogant confidence, remained empty. The gaps in the chicken wire roofing that it had exploited stayed unused. Her morning egg counts began to stabilize, then increase as her remaining hens felt secure enough to resume normal laying patterns. At first, Martha had been afraid to hope. She'd been hurt too many times, had invested too much money in failed solutions, had felt the bitter taste of disappointment too often to trust in what appeared to be a miraculous reprieve. But as September turned into October, as the aspen trees blazed gold and the first snows dusted the highest peaks, the truth became undeniable. The predator attacks had stopped. Not diminished, not reduced, stopped completely. Martha had stood at her kitchen window one morning, watching Duke's massive form disappear into the forest after his nightly visit, and a theory had begun forming in her mind. Bears, particularly grizzlies, were territorial animals. They claimed ranges and defended them against other predators. A large male grizzly like Duke, in his prime and obviously healthy, would command respect from other animals. His scent marking the property would serve as a warning. This territory is claimed, stay away. But it was more than just his presence, Martha had realized. Duke was actively protecting the farm. She'd found evidence of it once she knew what to look for. Claw marks on trees at the property boundary that were fresh, marking territory. Large paw prints in the soft earth near the chicken coops, circling the perimeter as if on patrol. And one morning, she'd found tufts of gray wolf fur caught on a blackberry bramble at the property's edge, mixed with what was unmistakably grizzly fur, evidence of a confrontation. Duke had fought the wolf, had driven it away, possibly killed it, definitely established that Martha's farm was under his protection. And the lynx, smart enough to recognize that challenging a territorial grizzly was a death sentence, had found easier hunting grounds elsewhere. Martha's chicken business, which had been in its death throes, had suddenly revived. Her flock had time to recover, to rebuild, without the constant losses to predation. The hens, no longer stressed by regular attacks, had increased their egg production. Martha had been able to resume her contracts with local restaurants and farmers markets. Money that had been flowing out in a desperate attempt to protect her livelihood had stopped hemorrhaging. Her retirement account, which she'd been draining to keep afloat, had stabilized. More than that, Martha had felt safe for the first time in months. The fear that had kept her awake, jumping at every sound, sleeping with a rifle she barely knew how to use, had evaporated. Duke's presence, paradoxically, had made her feel more secure than any fence or alarm system ever could. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic,
that as long as Duke claimed this territory, nothing would harm her or her farm. The irony wasn't lost on her. The rangers had been useless. The expensive fencing had been bypassed. The motion lights and ultrasonic deterrents had been ignored. But a grizzly bear, the most fearsome predator in North America, whom she'd befriended by offering him a seat at her dinner table, had solved all her problems simply by deciding her farm was worth protecting. Martha had canceled her plans to sell the farm. She'd unpacked the boxes she'd so carefully filled. She'd called the real estate agent and taken her property off the market. She was staying, and for the first time since Harold had died, she felt like she wasn't facing the world alone.
October deepened, bringing cold nights and shorter days. Duke continued his nightly visits, and Martha continued preparing food for him, though she'd learned what he preferred. Fish, above all else, particularly salmon and trout, but also large cuts of venison that she bought from a local hunter, and occasionally beef ribs that the butcher in town saved for her when she explained they were for a special friend. The butcher, a weathered man named Frank, who'd lived in these mountains all his 60-plus years, had given her a knowing look. "You're feeding that big grizzly that's been seen around your property, aren't you, Martha?" She'd considered denying it, but decided honesty was easier. "I am." "Dangerous game, your plan," Frank had said, but there'd been no judgment in his voice, only a kind of respect. "But I'll admit, your predator problems seem to have solved themselves. Word travels in a small town. Folks have noticed your chickens are doing well again." "Duke is protective," Martha had said, and Frank had laughed at the bear having a name. "Duke, huh? Well, if Duke ever gets tired of venison, you let me know. Can't say I've ever prepared meat for a bear before, but there's a first time for everything." Others in town had been less understanding. When Michael, true to his word, had written up his observations and submitted them to wildlife journals, and when word had spread through both scientific and local communities about the woman who was feeding a wild grizzly, Martha had received a visit from the same rangers who'd been unable to help her with the wolf and lynx. Mrs. Henderson, the older ranger, a stern woman named Patricia Valdez with 30 years of wilderness management experience, had begun. "We've received reports that you've been intentionally feeding a wild bear. You understand that's illegal in this state, and more importantly, it's incredibly dangerous. Habituating wildlife to human contact leads to what exactly? Leads to that bear protecting my property from predators you couldn't do anything about? Leads to my farm being profitable again? Leads to me feeling safe in my own home for almost a year. Ma'am, with respect, you're creating a situation that could result in human injury or death. If that bear becomes aggressive, he won't," Martha had said with absolute certainty. "Duke has been visiting for over a month now. He's never shown a moment of aggression. He eats what I give him and leaves. Meanwhile, the wolf that was destroying my livelihood is gone. The lynx that your regulations prevented you from dealing with is gone. My chickens are safe. I'm safe. You couldn't help me when I needed it, so forgive me if I don't take your advice now that I've solved the problem myself." Ranger Valdez had opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, clearly struggling with the fact that Martha's logic, however unorthodox and illegal, was sound. "Mrs. Henderson, I am required by law to warn you that continuing to feed wild bears carries a fine of up to $5,000 and possible criminal charges. If that bear injures anyone, you could be held liable. Then I suggest you tell people to stay away from my property at dusk. Duke comes, he eats, he leaves. We have an understanding. I'm not stopping." The rangers had left with the unsatisfying task of writing up a report about a situation they were powerless to change. Martha was violating the law, technically, but she was doing it on her own property. The bear hadn't shown any problematic behavior, and forcing the issue would require resources the Ranger Service didn't have for what was ultimately a harmless, if bizarre, situation. Word of the Bear Lady of Montana had spread beyond the local area. A regional news station had sent a reporter, a young woman in her 20s, who'd been both terrified and fascinated as she interviewed Martha on her porch while Duke ate his dinner at the table 15 feet away. The footage, which had gone viral online, showed Martha calmly discussing her chicken business while a massive grizzly bear sat in a chair like a human, delicately eating a large salmon. The attention had been overwhelming at first. Martha's phone had rung constantly with interview requests, book deal offers, even a documentary filmmaker who wanted to spend a month on her property filming Duke. She'd declined almost everything, fiercely protective of her privacy and unwilling to turn Duke into a spectacle. But the publicity had been good for her chicken business. Orders had tripled as people wanted eggs from the farm protected by a bear, and Martha had found herself needing to expand her flock to meet demand. November had arrived with heavy snows, and Martha had worried that Duke might hibernate, leaving her vulnerable again to whatever predators might chance their luck in his absence. But Duke had continued his nightly visits through the first snows, and Martha had noticed his appetite increasing as his body prepared for winter dormancy. She had started buying fish in bulk, keeping a large freezer in her barn stocked with salmon, preparing larger and larger meals as Duke's metabolic needs grew. Then, on a cold evening in mid-November, when the snow lay thick on the ground and Martha's breath frosted in the air as she set Duke's meal on the table, something extraordinary had happened again. Duke had arrived at his usual time, but he hadn't come alone. Behind him, moving with cautious steps, were two smaller bears. Cubs, Martha had realized, with a jolt of emotion that surprised her with its intensity.
By mid-December, word of the bear lady and her cubs had spread across the country. Wildlife enthusiasts, journalists, and curious travelers began showing up in town, hoping for a glimpse of Duke and his family. Some parked their cars along the dirt road that led to Martha's property, using binoculars and long camera lenses, hoping to catch a shot of the famous grizzly family dining on the porch. Martha hated the attention. She'd put up no trespassing signs, added locks to her gate, and even called the sheriff once when a group of tourists tried to sneak onto her property for a closer look. She wasn't interested in fame. All she wanted was peace, for herself, for Duke, and for the small patch of mountain land that had become their shared sanctuary. The rangers had visited again, this time with a biologist from the state wildlife department. They'd come armed with tranquilizer rifles and tracking collars, intending to tag Duke and the cubs for research and safety purposes. Martha had met them at her gate and refused to let them in. "You're not tranquilizing that bear," she'd said firmly. "He's not a threat, he's family." The biologist, a young man who clearly wasn't used to being challenged, had tried to explain the importance of tracking and data collection, but Martha had stood her ground. "You can collect all the data you want from the tracks around my property. You're not putting darts in my bears." The standoff had ended without escalation, mostly because Duke himself had appeared from the tree line halfway through the argument, his massive form looming like a moving mountain. The rangers had frozen, hands tightening on their rifles, but Martha had stepped forward and said calmly, "He's just watching. As long as you don't threaten anyone, he won't harm you." Duke had stood silently, eyes fixed on the strangers for a long, heavy moment, before turning and vanishing back into the woods. The message was clear. This was his land, and the woman at the gate was under his protection. After that day, the visits from officials had stopped. Winter deepened, blanketing the valley in heavy snow and cutting Martha off from town for days at a time. She didn't mind. Her pantry was full, her woodpile was stacked high, and each evening Duke and the cubs arrived as faithfully as clockwork. The bears ate, played, and sometimes lingered near the porch, curling up in the snow to rest while Martha sat in her rocker with a blanket over her knees, sipping tea and talking softly to them. Sometimes she imagined Harold sitting beside her, smiling at the absurd beauty of it all. The widow who had once been too scared to sleep alone in her house, now sharing her nights with a family of grizzlies. In late January, Duke began eating even more voraciously. Martha knew that it was a sign that his long winter rest was near. The cubs, too, were plumper now, their coats thick and glossy. One evening, after finishing their meal, Duke had lingered longer than usual on the porch. He'd looked at Martha for a long time, then made a low, rumbling sound, not aggressive, but deep and resonant, almost like a farewell. Martha had felt a lump rise in her throat. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" she whispered. Duke had blinked slowly, then turned and led his cubs toward the forest. This time, none of them looked back. For the next few nights, the porch remained empty. Martha had still set out food, though she knew they wouldn't come. Snow fell heavily, covering the plates, and she'd brush it away each morning, hoping against hope to see their tracks. But there were none. February was the loneliest month she'd ever lived through. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive. Yet deep down, she took comfort in knowing that Duke and his cubs were safe, hibernating somewhere in the mountains. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and waking the forest, Martha found herself rising earlier, checking the porch each morning like a child waiting for her father to return from a long trip. Then, one golden April evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, she heard it, the familiar crunch of heavy footsteps in the yard. Her heart leapt. She turned, and there he was, Duke. He looked leaner, but healthy, his fur darker and glossier after the winter's rest, and behind him came Scout and Ranger, now almost as tall as his father's shoulder, bounding forward with youthful energy. Martha's laughter broke the still air as tears streamed down her face. "You're back," she whispered. "You came back." Duke rumbled softly, his deep voice vibrating through her chest. He took his seat at the table as though no time had passed, and the cubs followed suit, each taking their familiar chairs. That night, Martha served them a feast, fresh salmon, venison, and honey she'd saved from her last harvest. They ate as twilight deepened, and when they finished, Duke rose, walked to the porch rail, and looked out over the valley, the land that had become theirs. Martha followed his gaze. The world felt alive again. Birds singing, trees budding, the promise of another year stretching ahead. She placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "Welcome home, my friend." Duke turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. In that moment, Martha understood what their bond had truly become. It wasn't just survival or even protection. It was kinship, born of mutual respect between two beings who had lost much and found something sacred in each other's company. That spring, and every spring after, Duke and his family returned. They came through storms, through years of drought, through the quiet passing of seasons, and the slow march of time. And long after Martha's hair had gone white and her hands had grown frail, the bears still came, guardians of a promise made in a moment of shared hunger and unspoken trust. And when the locals spoke of the Bear Lady of Montana, they did so with a kind of reverence, not for her fame, but for the impossible friendship she'd forged between human and beast, between loneliness and wildness, between the fragile heart of a woman and the untamed soul of a bear named Duke.
December had deepened, and Martha had known that hibernation was approaching. Bears typically denned in late November or early December in this region, depending on food availability and weather conditions. She'd started dreading the day when Duke and his cubs wouldn't show up for dinner, when the motion lights would stay dark, when she'd have to face the winter alone again without her unlikely protectors. But Duke had continued visiting well into December, his appetite enormous as he'd packed on the final pounds needed for winter dormancy. Martha had spent a small fortune on fish and meat, but she'd considered it the best money she'd ever spent. Every meal with Duke and his cubs was a gift, a moment of connection across species that most humans never experienced. On December 18th, a night when the temperature had dropped below zero and the stars had blazed with crystal clarity in the black sky, Duke had arrived with his cubs for what Martha had sensed would be their last visit before hibernation. She'd prepared a feast, 3 large salmon, 2 racks of beef ribs, and a whole roasted chicken for each cub. The bears had eaten slowly, almost reluctantly.
as if they too sensed that this meal was different, that it was a goodbye. After they'd finished, Duke had done something he'd never done before. He'd left his chair and walked directly to where Martha stood at the porch railing. Her breath had caught in her throat as 600 pounds of apex predator approached her with deliberate purpose. Every rational part of her brain had screamed at her to move, to run, to protect herself. But she'd stayed frozen, trusting the relationship they'd built over the past 3 months. Duke had stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his massive body in the frigid air, could smell the fish on his breath and the wild, musky scent of bear. He'd looked directly into her eyes, and in that moment, Martha had felt seen in a way that transcended words. Then, incredibly, gently, Duke had lowered his enormous head and pressed his forehead against her stomach, not hard enough to hurt, just firm enough to make contact. It was a gesture of affection, of gratitude, of connection. Martha's hands had moved of their own accord, coming to rest on Duke's broad head, her fingers sinking into the thick fur. She'd stood there, an elderly woman embracing a wild grizzly bear in the freezing December night, and felt more at peace than she had in years. The cubs had approached too, pressing against her legs, and Martha had found herself surrounded by bears, held in a circle of warmth and wild trust that she knew she'd remember for the rest of her life. They'd stayed that way for perhaps 2 minutes, maybe less, time losing meaning in the profound connection of the moment. Then Duke had pulled back, huffed softly to his cubs, and led them off the porch. At the forest edge, all three had looked back one final time. Martha had raised her hand in farewell, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "Sleep well, Duke. Keep your babies safe. I'll be here when you wake up in the spring." The motion lights had tracked their progress until they disappeared into the darkness, and then Martha had been alone again. But this time the loneliness didn't carry the sharp edge of fear it once had. Duke would be back. She knew it with the same certainty she knew the sun would rise. The winter had been long and harsh, with record snowfalls that buried her property under several feet of white. Martha had kept busy with her chickens, with her growing business, with the mundane tasks of surviving a Montana winter. But she'd thought about Duke and his cubs constantly, hoping they'd found a good den, hoping they were warm and safe in their hibernation, hoping that the spring would bring them back to her. There had been a few tense moments. In late January, during a particularly brutal cold snap when even the chickens had huddled together for warmth, a pack of coyotes had attempted to raid her coops. They'd been emboldened by hunger and desperation, and they'd been organized, working together to try to find a way through the fence. Martha had gone out with Harold's rifle, prepared to defend her flock, but something had stopped the coyotes before she'd even reached the coops. The pack had suddenly scattered, yelping and fleeing into the night as if they'd encountered something terrifying. Martha had found massive paw prints in the snow around the chicken coops. Duke's prints, she'd been certain of it. He'd been there, even in hibernation. Or perhaps he'd awakened briefly, sensing a threat to territory he'd claimed, and had driven the coyotes away before returning to his den. Grizzlies are known to occasionally wake during hibernation, especially in milder winters or if disturbed. The thought that Duke had roused himself from winter sleep to protect her farm had moved Martha to tears.
February and March had passed slowly, the snow gradually melting, the days growing longer, the first brave crocuses pushing through the thawing ground. Martha had prepared for Duke's return, stocking her freezer with fish, repairing the table and chairs on the porch that had weathered the winter, even planting some berry bushes along the property edge because she'd read that bears loved berries, and she'd wanted to provide additional food sources for Duke and his growing cubs. April had arrived with the tentative warmth of mountain spring, and Martha had started watching for signs of Duke's emergence. Grizzlies typically left their dens between late March and early May,
depending on elevation and individual factors. She'd known Duke's den had to be somewhere on or near her property, based on how quickly he'd appeared that night the coyotes had attacked, but she'd never tried to find it, respecting his privacy and understanding that approaching a den could be extremely dangerous. On April 7th, just as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost artificial in their vibrancy, the motion lights had triggered. Martha's heart had leaped into her throat as she'd rushed to the window. And there he was, Duke, emerging from the forest, looking slightly thinner than when she'd last seen him, but otherwise healthy and strong. Behind him, moving with the increased confidence of cubs who'd survived their first winter, came Scout and Ranger, noticeably larger than they'd been in December, well on their way to becoming adult bears. Martha had run outside without even grabbing a coat, heedless of the cold spring air, tears streaming down her face. "Duke, you came back! Oh, you beautiful creature, you came back!" Duke had crossed the yard with his familiar rolling gait, climbed the porch steps, and gone directly to his chair. The cubs, remembering the routine from before hibernation, had taken their own seats, and Martha, laughing and crying at the same time, had rushed to prepare their meal, talking to them the entire time. "I can't believe you're here. I've been so worried, waiting all winter wondering if you'd come back. Look at how big the cubs have gotten. Scout, Ranger, you've grown so much. Duke, you look wonderful. Are you hungry? Of course you're hungry. You've been sleeping for months." She'd served them the largest meal she'd ever prepared, and the bears had eaten with the ravenous appetite of animals emerging from months of fasting. Martha had sat at the table with them, just watching, just grateful, feeling like her family had come home. From that day on, life had returned to their routine, but enriched, deepened by the winter apart. Duke and his cubs had visited every evening, and their relationship with Martha had evolved into something even more profound. Word of the bears' return had spread through the community. The local news had done a follow-up story. More tourists had started driving past Martha's property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous bears, until Martha put up a large sign: "Private property, bear viewing hours, never. Trespassers will be prosecuted and possibly eaten." Her chicken business had continued to flourish. The phrase, "protected by bear," had become her unofficial brand. People loved the story, the fairy tale quality of a grandmother befriended by wild bears. Orders had poured in from across the state. As autumn had turned to autumn, Martha had realized that Duke and his family weren't just protecting her property, they were sharing it with her. The farm had become a neutral ground, a territory where humans and bears coexisted not just peaceably, but cooperatively. Now, as autumn had returned once again, a full year since that first remarkable dinner when a bear had sat at her table, Martha stood on her porch watching the sunset and waiting for the motion lights to trigger. She'd prepared their meal, fresh salmon, as always, Duke's favorite, and set 3 places at the table. The motion lights blazed to life, and Martha smiled. Right on time, as always. Duke emerged from the forest, now teenage Scout and Ranger following behind him, and the bear family made their way across the yard toward the porch where an elderly woman waited to share another evening meal with the most remarkable dinner guests in Montana. Martha Henderson, the Bear Lady of Montana, sat down at her dinner table with Duke and his children, and she was home.
Years later, when Martha finally did pass away at the remarkable age of 91, she was found peacefully in her bed, having died in her sleep in the farmhouse she'd refused to leave. Her children, going through her effects, found journals documenting every evening she'd spent with Duke and his family, thousands of photographs, and a will that specified her farm should be placed in a conservation trust, protected forever as a wildlife sanctuary. Duke had continued visiting Martha until the very end,
Even as she'd grown frailer, needing a walker and then a wheelchair to get around, even as her memory had started to fade and her hands had trembled too much to cook elaborate meals, Duke had come. The visits had become simpler. Martha would put out whatever food she could manage to prepare, and Duke would eat it, and they would sit together in comfortable silence, two old souls who'd found friendship in the most unlikely of places. Scout and Ranger had eventually left to establish their own territories, as young bears do, but they'd occasionally returned to visit, bringing their own cubs in time. Martha had delighted in meeting Duke's grandchildren, marveling at how the cycle continued, how trust could be passed down through generations. On the morning of her funeral, as her family gathered at the small cemetery 20 miles down the mountain, they saw something that made even the most skeptical among them believe in the extraordinary bond their mother had formed. There, sitting at the edge of the cemetery, watching the proceedings from a respectful distance, was an enormous grizzly bear with graying fur around his muzzle, accompanied by two slightly smaller bears beside him. Duke had come to say goodbye. The rangers, who'd been called by nervous mourners, had arrived prepared to tranquilize and relocate the bears, but they'd stopped when they'd seen the animals' behavior. The bears hadn't approached the humans, hadn't shown any aggression, hadn't done anything but sit and watch. And when the funeral concluded, when Martha's casket had been lowered into the ground next to her husband Harold's grave, the three bears had stood, looked at the assembled mourners one final time, and disappeared into the forest. They were never seen in the area again. Some people said Duke had known Martha was gone, that he'd come to pay his respects and then moved on, his purpose at the farm fulfilled. Others claimed it was just coincidence, that the bears had been passing through. But Martha's grandchildren, who'd grown up hearing stories of the remarkable bear who'd protected their grandmother's farm, who'd seen the photographs and read the journals, knew the truth. Duke had understood. He'd known Martha was gone, and he'd come to honor the woman who'd offered him a seat at her table, who'd trusted him when fear would have been the rational response, who'd been the only human he'd ever allowed into his family. The farm still stood, protected by the trust Martha had established. Her chickens still produced eggs under a new caretaker, though the business had never quite reached the heights it had when Duke had protected the property. Local guides sometimes brought tourists past the property, telling the story of the bear lady and her extraordinary relationship with a wild grizzly. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Montana mountains in shades of orange and purple, some people swore they could still see three bears sitting at the edge of the forest, watching over the farm where an unlikely friendship had changed everything, where a bear had learned to sit at a dinner table and a woman had learned that sometimes the wildest things in life bring the greatest joy.